So let's take a look at the nation's housing markets over the weekend. REA Group says there were just 571 auctions and a clearance rate nationally of a relatively low 52.5%. With kids back at school this week, we'll get a better idea about the appetite for housing in the coming month or so. Now in Sydney, there were just 111 auctions, but 64% of those managed to sell. In Melbourne, there were 147 auctions with a clearance rate of 66%. So you can see here the two major capitals, they were pretty reasonable. In Brisbane, just 43 auctions, and of those, just 21 were sold. In Adelaide, 34 auctions, and all but 7 of those sold. So it was pretty strong. In Canberra, 17 auctions, 9 sold, 8 of them still on the marketplace, 52.9%. So what might we expect from the housing markets as things do settle down in the coming weeks? Certainly the Reserve Bank rate decision next week will have an impact. But the supply of new housing is also an issue, especially with an expected big increase in population in the coming years. Angus Moore is an economist with REA Group's PropTrack and joins me now. Angus, always good to have you on the program. There is the issue right now. While people are concerned about rising interest rates and the level of housing into the future, there is an underlying demand for housing that is coming, that if you get a shortfall in building, there's only going to be just another boom down the track, isn't there?
Yeah, I would say we've actually seen a lot of that demand for housing over the past few years even. We saw through the pandemic that average household size actually fell. And what that means is that for the same number of people, we need more houses. So even in the absence of strong population growth across the pandemic, there was still really strong housing demand. And that was part of why we saw prices rise as quickly as they did. Not the whole reason. Obviously, falling interest rates was a very, very big part of it as well. But you're exactly right. With migration returning, and we can talk about that in a moment potentially, that's only going to add to housing demand, and it really underlines how important it is to build homes to accommodate all that demand. And
just one small thing that's happened today is that the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping has basically come out and said, if you're an international student, if you're a student, you've got to get back to university. And as a result, it means that those university students, if they wish to graduate, have got to get back to their universities outside of China. Now, that means if they do start the return to Australian universities, there's going to be a massive shortfall of accommodation because much of the accommodation they used to take up has already been picked up by local students.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing very tight rental markets. To your point there, vacancy rates across the country are in the order of 1% to 2%, depending on the city you're looking at, which is pretty low and lower than it was pre-pandemic. And yes, return of demand from overseas is only going to add to the extra pressure we're seeing there. It's hard to know exactly how many extra to expect from this diktat that we've had, but last year in November, statistics from the Department of Home Affairs suggest there's about 40,000 Chinese students that were still in China but studying in Australia. Now, that was obviously last year. This year, new academic year, new set of enrolments. Hard to know if that 40,000 is an overestimate, underestimate, who knows. But certainly we will see extra demand coming from overseas. And we are already seeing that in our search data. Compared to 12 months ago, there's nearly 2/3 more searches from overseas for rentals in Australia.
So that suggests that something is changing. Then there's the immigration story. In Australia, increasing immigration deliberately is another way of being able to stimulate not only the housing markets, but also the overall economy, but to take pressure off this shortage of workers. So this simply means that if there's any shortfall in the housing stock right now, it only means that there's going to be the greater demand, which is pushing prices up eventually.
Right. It's something we talk about all the time is the importance of building homes as a way to address affordability. It's no different here. The long-term affordability, both in terms of rental affordability and purchase, home ownership affordability, ultimately comes down to having enough homes. And arguably we just don't at the moment, and that's why Australian housing is as expensive as it is.
And that is not going to change anytime soon. There might be a lull because of interest rates, but what we're saying is it's a lull, it's not a long-term trend.
Right. We are seeing a lot of homes under construction at the moment, detached houses in particular, as a result of, in part, home builder and low interest rates over the past few years. But we're not actually completing them. We're not completing more homes in terms of finishing construction and them coming into the market to house people at a pace any quicker than we were pre-pandemic, despite the fact that there's nearly twice as many under construction as there was pre-pandemic. A big part of that is it's just been really hard to build houses. It's been hard to get labour, hard to work, even if you do have labour, because of days lost to sickness, days lost to weather in Sydney and Brisbane, and shortages of raw materials. Supply chains have just been really disrupted.
Tell you what, Angus, always good to chat to you about this. Angus Moore from REA Group, many thanks for your time.
Pleasure, thanks for having me.